Hey everybody, Max here for IGN. I'm with Jordan Vogt-Roberts. You may know him as the director of Kong Skull Island, which is a video gamey movie. You also worked on You're the Worst, which had a cameo from Borderlands in the first episode. And you've been champing at the bit to make the Metal Gear movie.
Also correct.
Is that happening? Are you doing that?
We just turned in the script, and I think it's one of the best scripts I've ever read. It's one of the coolest, weirdest, most Kojima things. Even me and being involved in it, I look at it as someone who was like, I would make the hell out of this movie, but if I wasn't involved in it, I would still look at that script and be like, holy shit.
Okay, so that's something I want to talk to you about, because we've seen a lot of video game movies over the years, and a lot of them really aren't great. There have been a lot of very, very bad ones, and there really haven't been any great ones. And I think part of the problem is that we've got, video games are kind of they're a new medium, you know? Like you're in your 30s, you're a fairly young director, and it seems like you're one of the first directors out there who's really vocal and a fan of games, but also of movies. Can you talk a little bit about sort of what's the difference between the mediums and what's the problem with making movies based on games?
Oh boy. Well, first of all, I do think that there basically have been good video game movies. They just weren't based on video games. I think both Snowpiercer and Edge of Tomorrow essentially, in my mind, function. Those are almost like perfect adaptations of video games that don't exist.
Yeah, Edge of Tomorrow is kind of a roguelike.
Yeah, but Edge of Tomorrow, even like just the mechanic of it is so embedded in the idea of how video games work, like respawning and continuing. And then Snowpiercer, just the left to right progression, like through a stage and then going into new levels, like that. To me, those are video game movies. They just happen to be not based on video games. But for me, the bigger thing that you're talking about, and I've said this in a lot of interviews, so people are probably like, we get it, like stop talking about the same thing, but there's a huge difference between an active experience and a passive experience, and they make you feel different things in different ways, and I think that most people have tried to adapt games by simply adapting plot mechanics and story, as opposed to sort of trying to tap into what you felt when you played that game. What did you feel the first time you play it? And then how do you translate that feeling cinematically?
Right. Which is like kind of the problem with the Uncharted movie, which has sort of been in development hell for 9 years or something, because Uncharted is so firmly rooted in Indiana Jones, which has been around before. Like we sort of have that.
Yeah, sure. But there's also, Uncharted does make you, it's more than just an Indiana Jones sort of knockoff. Like there are very specific things about the gameplay of Uncharted that you only feel in those games. Like the way those levels unfold, like it's these evolving set pieces, right? And in a weird way, most video game action has actually influenced film in a really weird way, where I think most bad action movies have sort of video game action where it just unfolds, and it's, to me, it always goes back to Phantom Menace. They're in a submarine, and a giant fish comes and grabs their thing, and then a bigger fish comes and grabs that thing.
There's always a bigger fish.
And then I'm pretty sure, yeah, we're gonna need a bigger boat. I'm pretty sure a bigger fish then grabs that thing. And it's action happening around the people. It's not John McClane running over, like choosing to run over glass, or Indiana Jones choosing to shoot a guy in the middle of the street fight. Those are moments that reflect character. There's a lot of action scenes in movies right now that are video game action in a bad way, where it's just cool things happening around the people without them making meaningful decisions that inform you of who these characters are and what they think. And so for me, a big part of like the press tour on Kong was actually trying to be like, I want to rewrite the narrative on this, where I would be in interviews talking to people, and I'd be like, they'd say, well, what were your big influences? And I'd go, video games. And then the PR people would pull me aside later and say, don't mention video games. And I was like, why? That's stupid. Like, they're like, yeah, but there's this association with video games and movies as a negative thing. And to me, you ask about like being a filmmaker that grew up on it, those are my influences. That's the stuff that shaped me. Like, and I'm part of this first wave of directors who like grew up on it.
Yeah.
Like my reference points are the same as if it was a movie or a book. It's just, that's a medium that I always grew up with.
Well, I mean, I think the one thing that Kong does really well is it's got this feeling of like boss fights. Like it's this reveal of like a new giant thing that's coming, you know, that's showing up, and there's that kind of that reveal and that pageantry, and it's different from like, I don't know, it's different from like a more conventional sort of monster reveal. But there's that kind of that boss fighty feeling in movies, and we've got this going back to like, you know, the guy with the AUG in Die Hard. You know, he's like, oh, he's not just a regular bad guy; he's like a tougher bad guy. How do you like, how do you encapsulate that kind of, like, how do you take that sort of thing you experience as a player in a game and sort of inject that into a passive story?
I mean, for me, a big part of Kong was also going back to Harryhausen. You know, where you go and you sort of encounter these new creatures, and that in itself almost has like a boss-like like effect. But when you go back to the original Kong, when you go back to Willis O'Brien, like the way those creatures were revealed, honestly, it's not that dissimilar. But I think that it's just about giving weight to the characters. But in Kong in particular, it was really important to me that generally you only experienced those things from the point of view of our protagonists. So every time you're being led there, you're not cutting to some random POV. You only really cut to Kong by himself when characters aren't watching him once. So you're always sort of being thrust into that through active protagonists in the film. So it's sort of like a POV thing.
Okay. Now, they've made a lot of video game movies.
I don't know if that makes sense, but okay.
No, I see what you're saying. I mean, I think it's funny because like the sort of the narrative choices made in games, I think one thing games have a problem with is passage of time. Like that's something that movies have down pat, whereas like the sort of the point of view is something that fits in more in games when you're actually controlling it. But no, I was gonna ask you what's your favorite video game movie that exists already?
I mean, honestly, it is like it would be Edge of Tomorrow or Snowpiercer.
What about one that's based on an existing video game?
The closest thing.
I realize that's a mean question because there's no right answer.
I actually think there's really cool stuff in the Silent Hill movie. I don't think it fully congeals, and there's a lot. It's really backloaded, and there's a lot of stuff that didn't quite translate. But I actually really like that director. Like Brotherhood of the Wolf is a movie that no one talks about.
Dude,
enough,
that's a Bloodborne movie.
Yeah, that movie is incredible, and no one. There's a. Someone the other day, I stopped being their friend, I swear to God, because we were talking about Brotherhood of the Wolf, and they said to me, "Oh, I really liked that movie until someone had a sword that became a whip that was made out of bones," and I was like, "You're an idiot. That's the coolest thing on the planet."
No,
like for me, like playing like Ivy and Soul Calibur and shit, like, oh yeah, whip sword, of course, and you see that in Brotherhood of the Wolf, and you're like. So I stopped being that person's friend.
I think that's a good decision.
Brotherhood
of the Wolf is fun as hell. They're doing like Native American karate in like Victorian France or something and fighting a.
And you want to know something really sad is, go on your computer right now, try and find a legal way to instantly watch Brotherhood of the Wolf.
I had to. I'm not joking. I bought this a couple months ago. I had to go on Amazon and buy a used DVD. It doesn't exist on Blu-ray unless you get the German version or something.
You truly can't go to iTunes, Netflix. There's not a way to stream that film.
I know.
It's so sad.
I tried. It was like a journey for me.
Watch Brotherhood of the Wolf if you haven't seen it. It's incredible.
Yeah, go watch. I'm actually really happy you brought that up. I wanted to talk about that for ages. Anyway,
this is just a PSA about how good Brotherhood of the Wolf is. Check it out.
Brotherhood of the Wolf, the best video game movie that you can't legally watch online anywhere. There's the headline for this video.
And BitTorrents don't exist.
Well, Jordan, I love hearing your perspectives on games and movies, and I'm dying to see your Metal Gear movie when it someday comes out, I hope.
If and when. It's one of the coolest scripts I've ever read.
Sweet.
It's awesome. But I was talking to Hideo about this the other day, because he thinks it's funny that I grew up on his stuff and like idolize him, and so. But how did he put it? We were doing a talk together in Tokyo about my first movie, because Kings of Summer never had a proper release in Japan, so it just had a proper release, and Kojima-san wrote the liner notes for the DVD. So for me, that's like one of the most surreal things possible. So I'm sitting there in a store with Kojima-san promoting my first movie that was never released in Japan. And he was just talking about how, and he put it so succinctly, he basically was just like, there will be a time in which it ceases to be weird that filmmakers are influenced by video games. For me, this is just something I've always had, like it rewired my brain at a young age. And you think about how different our upbringing was and how sort of video games were still kind of this niche, obscure thing versus kids now, right?
Yeah, they're everywhere.
I think more so, if you asked a bunch of random kids, do you watch movies or do you play video games? I bet you more kids would say, yeah, I play games. Like movies now are like for cinephiles only. It's a weird thing.
I mean, I think there's an interesting parallel with comic books, and like it took us a long time to get to the point where there are like good comic book movies, and we're finally kind of there.
Right.
And now kids are growing up with games, so it's like a different different animal.
Right, well, but it's about understanding, I think, the language of it. Like to me, it always goes back to like what logically would compel you to say, I'm in a room, I should push this box in a corner and it's gonna unlock something in like a Zelda way, like, or I'm gonna shoot this eye with an arrow. There's no real world logic that relates to that. There's weird like Hyrule logic.
Sure, yeah.
But you truly like each game has its own language, right? Like Metroid and whatever you want to play, Final Fantasy, they each have their own internal like logic systems that if you don't understand, you're like, well, what is this? And I think that there is a wave of filmmakers coming right now who grew up on that, understand that logic, and understand how to hopefully translate what those things made us feel when we were young. Like, when I was young and you play Super Metroid for the first time, even on the SNES, like the weird feeling of being isolated, alone on a foreign planet, like it hits you. I learned altruism, the concept of it, from the end of Super Metroid. Like when the baby saves you, that like taught me a life lesson, And I just think that there's a wave of filmmakers that are gonna come up that had those same experiences, and for some reason I'm just, I guess, one of the first.
Well, maybe after Metal Gear, do like a Metroid movie. I'd be down to see that.
I have a pitch for a Metroid movie that they'll never let me do. It's too crazy.
Can we hear it? The last Metroid is in captivity. The galaxy is at peace.
It legitimately would be her alone. Like it would be a little bit of her talking to herself, but like as soon as they introduce other talking characters in those games, to me it loses everything. You put her alone, and it's like it's almost got a little bit more to do with like the silence of a movie like Drive, like the quietness, and having it be like a real intense mood piece, but mixed with sci-fi.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, so much of Metroid is the last act of Alien. It's just
it's the best.
Corridors.
It's the best.
Anyway,
hey Nintendo, why can't I play Metroid Prime on my Switch? I
look
really
into
want
it,
to know
Nintendo.
This. Yeah, Nintendo, who's watching this? I know clearly you're watching this. Why can't I play it? And when you do allow it, bring back the lock-on mechanic, so I don't have to aim like a first-person shooter. It's a first-person adventure, and I want to play it that way.
Thanks, Jordan. For everything else, whatever this just was, keep it locked on IGN.